Ethan had always been the quiet, hard-working type. Fresh out of college, he had landed a job at a prestigious advertising firm, excited to make his mark in the industry. The company, renowned for its high-profile clients and innovative campaigns, was the kind of place where long hours and ruthless competition were the norm. Ethan had hoped to thrive in such an environment, eager to showcase his creativity and dedication. But from his first day, it became clear that his boss, Dominic, was going to make his life difficult. Dominic was the kind of man who demanded perfection and showed no mercy when expectations weren't met. With his tailored suits, cold eyes, and a reputation for being ruthless, he seemed to relish pointing out Ethan's every mistake. He was methodical, precise, and unrelenting, qualities that had made him one of the most successful executives at the firm. Yet, those same qualities made him impossible to please. He would criticize Ethan during meetings, raise his voice when things weren't done to his liking, and constantly belittle him in front of their coworkers. Ethan wasn't sure why Dominic had singled him out. Was it something personal? Had he somehow offended him in those first few days? Or was Dominic just the kind of boss who thrived on intimidation? Whatever the reason, the pressure began to wear Ethan down. Every morning, he dreaded going to work, his stomach in knots as he anticipated another day of Dominic's condescending remarks. He tried his best to keep up with the demands, staying late to perfect his presentations and double-check every email. But it never seemed to be enough. No matter how hard he worked, Dominic always found something wrong. His coworkers noticed too. Some would give him sympathetic looks, but no one ever stepped in to defend him. The culture at the firm was clear. You either adapted to the pressure, or you got out. One Friday evening, after a particularly brutal week, Ethan found himself staying late again, alone in the office. The glow of his computer screen was the only light in the otherwise darkened room, demanding it be completely overhauled by Monday. Ethan sighed, rubbing his eyes. His vision was blurry from staring at the screen for too long, and his back ached from hunching over his desk. He wasn't sure how much longer he could take this. As he contemplated another hour of revisions, he heard footsteps behind him. Still here. Dominic's voice was smooth but cold, as usual. Ethan tensed up. He hadn't expected to see his boss. He turned slightly in his chair, but avoided making eye contact. Yeah, he replied quietly, his voice sounding small in the vast, empty office. Just finishing up. Dominic stood there for a moment, silent. Ethan could feel his presence, imposing as always. But this time, there was something different in the air. When Ethan finally glanced up, he was surprised to see that Dominic wasn't glaring at him or offering a sharp critique. Instead, his expression was almost thoughtful. "Why do you stay so late all the time?" Dominic asked, his voice lower than usual. "Most of the team leaves right after hours." Ethan blinked, confused by the question. Why was Dominic asking him this? Just trying to keep up, he answered, shrugging. He hesitated before adding, "I know I'm not your favorite employee." Dominic raised an eyebrow, but there was no immediate retort, no sarcastic comment. Instead, he walked over to Ethan's desk, leaning against the edge with his arms crossed. He looked at Ethan with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if he were studying him. "Is that what you think?" Dominic asked, his voice softer than usual. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Isn't it obvious?" he said, shaking his head. "You're always on my case. It feels like no matter what I do, it's never good enough." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Ethan regretted saying them. He wasn't the type to talk back to his boss, especially not Dominic. But after months of enduring the relentless pressure and constant criticism, he couldn't hold it in any longer. To his surprise, Dominic didn't react with anger. He didn't snap back or criticize him. Instead, he seemed to consider Ethan's words carefully, the tension in his posture softening just a little. "You're not bad at your job, Ethan," Dominic finally said, his tone measured. "In fact, you're one of the best I've got. That's why I push you so hard." Ethan blinked, completely taken aback. Had he heard that right? Dominic had just complimented him? The thought seemed almost impossible. For months, all he had heard from Dominic was criticism. Now, out of nowhere, he was being told he was one of the best. What? Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dominic sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, a rare gesture that seemed almost human. Look, I know I can be a bit much, Dominic admitted, his usual composed exterior beginning to crack. But you've got potential. More than most people I've worked with, and he hesitated, his eyes flicking to Ethan's. And for the first time, Ethan saw something vulnerable in the man who had made his life hell for months. Dominic's gaze softened, and he leaned in slightly, as if he was about to reveal something important. It's not just your work, Dominic said, his voice quieter now. I think I've been tough on you because I've been trying to fight something else. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure where Dominic was going with this, but the air between them suddenly felt charged with something unspoken, something deeper than the usual dynamic of boss and employee. I've noticed you, Dominic admitted, his voice barely above a whisper now, not just as an employee, as more. Ethan stared at him, speechless. Was this the same Dominic who had made every day at work a nightmare? The same man who had seemed to take pleasure in tearing him down? And yet, as he looked at Dominic now, the walls that his boss had built around himself seemed to be crumbling. The sharp, intimidating exterior was fading, and Ethan was seeing a man who, like him, was struggling with something deeper. I didn't know how to deal with it. Dominic continued, his expression conflicted. I couldn't admit it to myself, and instead, I took it out on you. Ethan's mind was racing. He had never expected this. Not from Dominic. But beneath the shock, there was something else. He realized that despite everything, the insults, the harsh critiques, he had always been drawn to Dominic. There was something magnetic about him. Something Ethan couldn't deny, even if he had hated the way Dominic treated him. You don't have to fight it, Ethan said softly, surprising even himself with the words. Dominic met his eyes, and for a moment, everything between them was still. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Dominic reached out, his hand brushing against Ethan's. It was a tentative gesture, a silent apology, and a confession all at once. Ethan felt a warmth spread through him, the tension of the past few months melting away. In that quiet office, under the glow of their computer screens, something shifted between them. The boss and employee roles faded, and what remained was two men, both flawed, both afraid, but both undeniably drawn to one another. Dominic's fingers curled around Ethan's, and for the first time, he smiled genuine, soft, and vulnerable. I don't want to fight it anymore, he murmured. Ethan smiled back, his heart pounding in his chest. Then don't. In that moment, they both knew things would change. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But as they stood there, hands intertwined, they realized that maybe, just maybe, they had found something worth fighting for. Ethan's mind whirled as he replayed the last few minutes. He had spent months dreading Dominic's sharp criticisms, yet now, here they were both vulnerable in ways he never imagined. Could this shift between them last beyond this quiet moment? Would Dominic retreat back into the harsh boss he had always been on Monday morning? You've had me all wrong, Ethan, Dominic said, his voice pulling Ethan out of his thoughts. It's not that I think you're weak or incapable. I see your potential. And I was afraid. Afraid? Ethan echoed, his brow furrowing in confusion. Dominic nodded, a faint shadow crossing his face. Afraid of how much I noticed you. Not just your work, but you. He paused, the weight of his admission sinking between them. It was easier to push you away by being tough on you. Easier to keep things professional. Ethan's breath caught. The words felt heavy, meaningful in a way he hadn't anticipated. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Dominic wasn't just a ruthless boss, he had been hiding behind that persona, shielding himself from feelings he didn't know how to handle. I don't know how to deal with this either, Ethan confessed. But I do know that this, he gestured to their entwined hands. This feels right. Dominic looked at Ethan with a vulnerability that seemed at odds with the powerful man he presented to the world. You have no idea how much I've wanted this, he whispered. Dominic noticeably changed his behavior towards Ethan from that day onward. The other coworker were shocked to see their boss being nice towards the person he always ridiculed. Dominic started picking up Ethan from his house so they could go to work together. Some weeks later, Dominic asked Ethan to be his boyfriend, and they became public about their relationship. The end.